Vivian Sinclair sat quietly, enjoying a rare moment of peace in the bustling city. Despite her immense success, she preferred to blend in, dressed simply, finding solace in the ordinary. But the calm was short-lived. Officer Walker, known for his unchecked authority, approached with a hardened expression. His eyes held the weight of prejudice as he looked her over, dismissing her without a second thought. "You think you can just sit here?" he sneered. Vivian met his gaze, steady and unwavering. She had faced far greater battles in her rise to power. Without reacting to his hostility, she remained composed, her silence unsettling him. Walker's tone turned sharp. "This is a decent neighborhood, not for people like you." His words carried the sting of racism, but Vivian refused to be rattled. As he reached for his cuffs, determined to remove her, something unexpected happened. A bystander recognized her. Whispers spread, phones emerged, and soon the street buzzed with realization. A powerful black billionaire treated with such disdain. The injustice was undeniable. A journalist nearby caught the scene on camera. Within minutes, social media erupted with outrage. The truth of Walker's prejudice was no longer hidden behind a badge. His arrogance turned to fear as he saw his career crumbling before him. Vivian, still calm, stood tall. She didn't need to fight with words. Her presence alone shattered the illusion of superiority. The very people he sought to control were now his judges. By evening, news outlets covered the incident. Walker faced consequences he never imagined. The world had changed, and ignorance had no place in it. Vivian walked away, unshaken, a symbol of resilience. The battle against racism wasn't over, but today, the truth had won. Vivian clenched her hands beneath her coat, steadying herself against the surge of anger. Years of hardship had taught her control, never letting prejudice shake her resolve. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice firm yet calm. "I'm just sitting here." Walker let out a cold chuckle. "You don't get it, do you? I decide what's right and wrong. And you, looking like that, don't belong here." The weight of his words pressed down, but Vivian refused to be pushed aside by ignorance. She had fought her way to the top, breaking barriers, proving that black success was unstoppable. She wouldn't bow now. "You have no right to tell me I can't sit here," she said, her eyes locked onto his. Walker's jaw tensed. He stepped closer, his stance menacing. "Think you're smart, huh?" His voice dripped with condescension. "Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respecting the law." Vivian's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time she had faced injustice, though never this openly, right in the middle of the street. Walker moved even closer. She could see the disdain in his eyes, the hunger for control. Then he gave the order. "Stand up." His hand hovered over his gun belt, a silent threat. His gaze swept the empty street, seeking justification, a witness to validate his abuse. But he had miscalculated. What he failed to notice was the quiet hum of a camera phone recording from a distance. The world was watching, and the world was about to see what happened when power met prejudice and refused to bow. The silence of the street made the moment even heavier. "I'm not breaking any law," Vivian said, her voice steady but firm. She didn't move, not in defiance, but because she knew she had every right to be there. Anger simmered beneath her calm exterior, but she refused to show weakness. Any sign of fear would only embolden Walker. He smirked, leaning in. "Who do you think you are? You think you're special? Anyone can be dragged to the station if I decide." Vivian met his stare without hesitation. Her silence, filled with unwavering confidence, only fueled his frustration. His expression twisted in irritation before he suddenly shoved her shoulder. She stumbled but quickly regained her balance. Disrespect burned in her chest, but she remained firm. Walker's gaze was colder now, more dangerous. "You have no right to do that," she said, her voice low but powerful. Walker's patience snapped. He grabbed her arm, yanking her up with unnecessary force. "You think there's anyone here to protect you?" he muttered, his voice laced with threat. "I am the law here." Vivian clenched her jaw as his grip tightened. Her heart pounded, but she refused to look away. She would not back down. Then, a voice cut through the tension, firm and commanding. "Take your hands off her. Now." Walker turned sharply, eyes narrowing as he faced Daniel Reed. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, but he quickly masked it. "Who are you?" Walker snapped. "This isn't your business. Move along." Daniel stepped forward, unfazed. "I saw everything, and I won't stand by while she's treated unfairly." His calm yet sharp tone left no room for argument. His gaze met Vivian's for a brief moment, a silent promise that she was no longer alone. Walker forced a smirk. "It's just a misunderstanding, sir. I'd advise you not to interfere with police matters unless you want trouble." Daniel didn't flinch. "I'll take that risk if it means defending her rights. If you think this abuse of power will go unchallenged, you're mistaken." Walker's grip loosened slightly, but the hostility lingered. His eyes darted between them, calculating his next move. Then, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "I'll remember this." He let go of Vivian, stepping back, his glare lingering on her. "But don't think this is over. Not everyone will be here to protect you next time." Daniel didn't budge. "We'll see who really needs protection, Officer Walker." A tense silence followed before Walker finally retreated, his footsteps heavy as he returned to his patrol car. Even as he drove away, his cold stare lingered. Vivian exhaled slowly, the weight of the encounter settling in. She turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, but with meaning. Daniel gave a small nod. The battle wasn't over, but at least for now she wasn't fighting alone. Daniel's voice was firm. "Vivian, we need to make sure he's held accountable. I couldn't just stand by and watch that happen." She stood silently for a moment, the tension still coursing through her veins. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. But the relief was fleeting. Another patrol car pulled up, its flashing red and blue lights cutting through the dim night. Two officers stepped out, their strides firm, their expressions unreadable. "We need you to come with us," one of them said, his voice steady, void of sympathy. Daniel moved to protest, but Vivian shook her head slightly. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering. She had fought her whole life to prove her strength, and she wouldn't falter now. "Don't worry, Daniel," she said, her voice calm despite the weight of the moment. "I'll be fine." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll call a lawyer right away. Don't let them do anything without one." Vivian gave him a small, knowing smile before stepping into the patrol car. The cold metal of the seat pressed against her, a stark contrast to the fire burning inside her. City lights flickered through the window as they drove, but the streets, once familiar, felt strangely distant. When they arrived, the slam of the car door echoed in the heavy silence. The police station was harsh and unwelcoming. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their glow sterile and unfeeling. The scent of disinfectant lingered, sharp and clinical. Vivian was led through the station past murmuring officers and clicking keyboards into a small, silent interrogation room. She sat on the cold metal chair, placing her hands on the table, steadying herself. Her pulse still raced, adrenaline refusing to fade. She closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from memories of her past. She had faced worse. She had overcome greater. No matter what happened next, she would not break. The door creaked open. Walker stepped inside, his slow strides deliberate, his smirk dripping with arrogance. He stopped just short of the table, looking down at her with cold amusement. "You really think having someone stand up for you changes anything?" His voice was low, slicing through the air like a blade against glass. Vivian looked up, her eyes locking onto Walker's. His sneer held a cruel edge, but she refused to waver. "You think you've won?" he taunted. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest, but she controlled her voice, keeping it steady. "I don't think I've won," she said slowly, each word deliberate. "But I know this is just the beginning." Walker's smirk faded, his expression tightening. The room felt heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he stepped back, his eyes flashing with barely restrained anger. "You'll soon see who really has power here," he muttered before turning and slamming the door behind him. Silence settled once more, but this time it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like clarity. Walker's threats echoed in her mind, but instead of fear, they fueled something else, a fire, a purpose. She had fought too hard in life to be silenced now. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock filled the air, marking time, each second sharpening her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about justice. For herself. For others like her who had been mistreated but had no voice to fight back. The door swung open, breaking the silence. Vivian turned her head and met the sharp, determined eyes of Sandra Mills. The woman carried an air of authority, her every movement measured and precise. Behind her, Daniel entered, his face tense but his presence solid and unwavering. "Vivian." Sandra's voice was firm yet reassuring as she pulled out a chair and set a sleek black briefcase on the table. The hallway light behind her cast a faint glow into the otherwise cold room, a small reminder that hope still existed beyond these walls. Daniel took a seat beside Vivian, his expression filled with both concern and conviction. "I spoke with Sandra on the way here," he said, his voice low but steady. "She's one of the best. We're not letting this go easily." Sandra's gaze met Vivian's, unwavering. "We'll bring Walker and anyone involved into the light," she assured her. "But first I need to hear everything, from start to finish, no details left out." Vivian took a deep breath, steadying herself. The weight of what had happened still clung to her, but she knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over, and she was ready. Vivian took a deep breath and began recounting everything, from the moment she sat on the shop steps to the sound of heavy footsteps approaching, to Walker's arrogance and blatant intimidation. Every word carried the weight of injustice, the sting of being targeted for no reason other than prejudice. Sandra listened intently, jotting down notes with sharp precision, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Vivian described how Walker shoved her and hauled her to the station under false pretenses, Sandra's jaw tightened. Beside her, Daniel sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists. Every detail only deepened his anger. He had witnessed injustice before, but hearing Vivian's first-hand account made it even more unbearable. "Walker has a history of abusing his power," Sandra finally said, her voice firm. "I've heard rumors, but no one ever stepped forward with enough force to challenge him. This time it's different." Vivian, still shaken but regaining her composure, asked, "What's our next move?" Sandra shut her notebook and straightened. "First, we file a lawsuit against Walker and the police chief. This isn't just about one corrupt cop. It's about exposing a system that allows people like him to operate unchecked." Daniel nodded, his gaze locking onto Vivian's. "They won't take this lying down. They'll fight back, try to discredit you, twist the narrative, and do whatever they can to make this go away." Vivian remained silent for a moment, then lifted her chin, her resolve unshaken. "I've faced this kind of treatment my whole life. They can try to break me, but I won't back down. This fight isn't just for me, it's for everyone who's been silenced. Sandra gave a small, approving nod, a rare smile flickering across her lips. Then we start now. I'll contact the press. This won't stay in the dark any longer. Walker picked the wrong person this time. A heavy silence followed, but it no longer carried fear or hesitation. It was the silence before battle, a moment of quiet resolve before taking a stand. And then, the storm began. News of Vivian Sinclair's lawsuit spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a local headline, it was national. Major media outlets, social platforms, and influential voices all turned their attention to the black billionaire who refused to be silenced by an unjust system. The world was watching, and this time, justice wouldn't be ignored. Billionaire challenges the system. Vivian Sinclair leads the fight against abusive power. Headlines flooded every major news outlet and social media platform. Standing in her office, Vivian gazed out the window at the vibrant city below, bathed in sunlight. Yet a heavy weight pressed on her chest. She knew the real battle was just beginning. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. "Vivian, have you read the comments?" His voice carried a mix of concern and urgency. "We're getting a lot of support, but also plenty of backlash." "I've seen them," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. On her computer screen, comments scrolled rapidly. Some hailed her as a pioneer, applauding her courage in challenging injustice. But others questioned her motives, accusing her of using the situation to build her image or serve personal interests. "These criticisms are just the beginning," Daniel warned. "They'll dig into your past, twist facts, and try to discredit you. But you're not alone. Sandra is ready to respond to anything they throw at us." Vivian remained silent, watching the cars below. She thought back to her childhood, the struggles, the fight to be seen in a neighborhood that dismissed her dreams. Those memories, once painful, had become a source of strength. "I know, Daniel. I've prepared for this," she said firmly. "We won't back down." A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Sandra entered, a thick file in hand, her expression unwavering. "Vivian, we need to talk," she said, placing the file on the desk. "Today's press conference is critical. This is your chance to take control of the narrative, to make it clear why we're fighting." Vivian nodded, her resolve steady, but the weight of responsibility heavy. "I understand, Sandra. We need to deliver a strong, clear message." "Exactly," Sandra agreed. "But be ready for anything. Reporters will try to throw you off with tough questions. Some won't be fair." Daniel sat beside Vivian, his eyes filled with unwavering support. "You're not doing this alone, we're all with you," Vivian exhaled, steadying herself. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced. That afternoon, the press conference room was packed. Camera flashes flickered like lightning. The low murmur of reporters created an air of tense anticipation. Vivian stepped onto the podium, her heart racing, but when she met the sea of expectant faces, she found her steadiness. Sandra stood at the side of the room, documents in hand, eyes locked on Vivian, ready to intervene if necessary. Vivian took a breath. Then she spoke, her voice strong and unwavering. "Thank you all for being here today. Today, I stand not just for myself, but for all who have been silenced, all who have suffered injustice without a voice. Abuse of power cannot continue. Change must happen." The room remained still for a moment before reporters launched into a barrage of questions, some supportive, others laced with skepticism. An older journalist stood, his voice carrying doubt. "Miss Sinclair, do you truly believe this is about justice, or is this just a way to boost your public image?" Vivian met his gaze, unwavering. "I don't need to boost my image, sir. she replied, her voice steady and firm. Everything I've achieved has been through relentless hard work. What I'm doing today isn't for fame or fortune. It's about dignity. It's about stopping abuse, not just for me, but for every person who has ever been ignored or dismissed. A shift rippled through the room. Reporters who had arrived expecting a spectacle now saw something different. Vivian wasn't just a billionaire. She was a force of resilience. From the sidelines, Daniel smiled, nodding with quiet pride. Sandra's sharp eyes softened as she watched Vivian take control of the narrative. When Vivian stepped out of the press room, exhaustion pressed into her muscles, but her heart held steady. The late afternoon sun cast golden hues over the city, and she realized this wasn't just about defending herself. It was about inspiring hope. Daniel and Sandra walked beside her, all three aware that the hardest battles were yet to come. As they reached the grand lobby, a man in a police uniform stood waiting. The ceiling lights reflected off the badge on his chest, catching Vivian's attention. Daniel shot him a wary glance, while Sandra's grip tightened around her stack of documents. The officer stepped forward, his face tense but resolute. "Excuse me, Miss Sinclair," he said, voice low yet certain. "I'm Officer Grant. I have something important to tell you." A brief silence fell over them. Daniel inhaled deeply, his eyes scanning Grant, trying to read his intent. Sandra took a cautious step forward. "We're listening, Officer Grant," she said, her tone measured yet firm. Grant swallowed hard, gathering courage. "I've worked with Walker for years. I know exactly who he is and what he's done." He hesitated, then continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I've seen him abuse his power, targeting those who couldn't fight back. And I stayed silent, out of fear, out of pressure from above." A wave of emotion surged through Vivian. She knew how rare and dangerous it was for an officer to speak against his own. "So what changed?" she asked, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. Grant exhaled sharply, eyes filled with guilt. "When I saw you stand up to him, I realized my silence was no longer acceptable. I couldn't keep looking the other way. What Walker did isn't just wrong. It destroys trust. It corrupts the very idea of justice." Daniel stepped forward, his gaze searching Grant's. "You understand what this means for you, don't you? You're putting your career, maybe even your safety, on the line." Grant gave a weary smile, nodding. "I know, but if I don't do this now, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror again. Justice is worth the price." Sandra studied him, her sharp eyes assessing his sincerity. Then, for the first time that day, she smiled. Just slightly, but with respect. "If you're willing to testify and give an official statement, it will make all the difference. We need all the support we can get to expose this." Grant straightened his shoulders, determination hardening in his gaze. He looked directly at Vivian. "I'm ready. I'll give you everything you need. Everyone deserves to know the truth about Walker and what he's done." The air in the lobby settled. The heavy silence was no longer filled with tension, but with trust and solidarity. Vivian felt a wave of emotion. She wasn't just fighting Walker and the system anymore. She was gaining strength from those willing to stand for what was right. "Thank you, Grant," she said, her voice low but sincere. "You don't know how much this means to me, and to so many others." Grant gave a faint smile, his eyes reflecting rare warmth. "You don't need to thank me. This is something I have to do." As Grant left to prepare the next steps, Vivian turned to Daniel and Sandra. Their eyes held the same unspoken agreement. This battle had reached a turning point. They weren't alone anymore. "We just gained a major ally," Sandra said firmly. "Now we need to move fast and turn this into legal strength." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on Vivian's shoulder, his pride unmistakable. "We're making a difference. And you're at the heart of that change." Vivian looked out the window. The twilight sky stretched over the city, streetlights flickering to life. A new strength rose within her. Justice was no longer a distant dream. With allies like Grant and unwavering support beside her, the truth would finally come to light. Outside, a crowd had gathered early. Journalists, supporters, and curious onlookers murmured among themselves, their voices blending into a tense Flashing cameras lit up the entrance, capturing every step Vivian took as she entered the courthouse, her gaze steady and unshaken. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the seats, ready to broadcast live. Citizens, drawn by the case's media storm, watched with quiet anticipation. The energy in the room was electric, thick with tension. At the plaintiff's table, Vivian and Sandra sat composed, while Daniel positioned himself behind them, his expression tense but filled with unwavering support. Then Walker entered. His face was cold, his sharp eyes scanning the room like knives. Yet Vivian caught it, that flicker of unease behind his mask. His team of lawyers surrounded him, their carefully crafted confidence barely concealing their concern. Sandra stood, stepping forward with quiet authority. Her eyes swept the jury before locking in, her voice ringing through the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about one incident. It is a reflection of a much larger issue within our system. Her words carried weight, cutting through the hushed murmurs. Vivian Sinclair is not just a victim. She stands for countless others who have suffered abuse of power without a voice. Today, we seek justice not just for her, but for all those silenced. The jury listened intently. Their faces, men and women of different ages and professions, bore the heavy burden of deciding the case's fate. Then, the moment of truth arrived. Grant was called to the stand. As he stepped forward, the courtroom fell into an eerie silence. He moved with confidence, yet the weight of his decision was clear in his eyes. This testimony could change everything. Tension hung thick in the air. Grant glanced at Walker before turning his focus to the jury. "I've worked with Officer Walker for many years," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I've witnessed his actions, his abuse of power, things I remained silent about for far too long." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Grant recounted specific instances of Walker targeting the vulnerable, using unnecessary force. Each story heightened the tension, sharpening the jury's focus. Vivian watched Walker closely. His face remained cold, but his grip on the table tightened. The truth was chipping away at his feigned confidence. "Thank you, Officer Grant," Sandra said, concluding her questioning. She turned to Vivian, her gaze resolute. This was the moment they had prepared for. They had just secured a critical foothold in the case. Walker's lawyer stood, his steps measured, a forced smile on his lips. His eyes gleamed with calculated intent. "Officer Grant, you've worked alongside Walker for years. Do you have a personal motive for testifying against him?" His tone was smooth but laced with doubt. Grant didn't flinch. His response was firm. "My motive is justice, the truth I've kept silent about for too long. If I don't speak up now, I become part of the problem." Behind him, Vivian's heart pounded. Every word resonated in the room. She caught a glimmer of hope in Daniel's eyes. Sandra, too, offered a faint smile, one of trust and encouragement. The trial stretched on, an unrelenting battle of questions and intense arguments. Walker's lawyers scrambled to justify his actions, steering the narrative in every direction possible. But each time, Sandra skillfully redirected the focus back to the undeniable truth. Walker had abused his power. By the end of the first day, Vivian stepped out of the courtroom, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the city. The buzz of reporters and onlookers continued, but inside her, a new strength had taken root. She had stood firm. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but with the unwavering support of those beside her, she knew justice was no longer a distant dream. Day 2 of the trial. The air outside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The hum of conversations, the shuffle of reporters, the murmurs of supporters, it all blended into a tense, expectant rhythm. Vivian stood at the entrance exuding quiet confidence, though she couldn't ignore the faint nervousness seeping in. As she entered the courtroom, her eyes met Sandra's. She was meticulously arranging documents, her movements precise. Beside her, Daniel stood, his expression a mix of determination and concern. They gave her a slight nod of encouragement. Today, everything they had fought for, every sacrifice, every ounce of courage, would be tested. At the defendant's table, Walker sat motionless, his face unreadable. But Vivian knew beneath the surface cracks were beginning to form, but his clenched hands betrayed his tension. His legal team whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with calculation, scrambling for a way to turn the situation around. Sandra stepped forward, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is a reminder that power, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon of destruction. But today, we are here to prove that justice prevails when the truth is brought to light. She turned, meeting the eyes of each juror. This trial isn't just about one man. It's about affirming that our society will not tolerate the abuse of power. Her words seemed to send a ripple through the courtroom. The jurors exchanged glances, a silent agreement forming between them. Across the room, Walker's attorneys struggled to maintain composure. They presented their final rebuttal, but their arguments lacked conviction. The strength had drained from their case. Then, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The minutes stretched like hours. Each tick of the clock tested Vivian's patience. She sat still, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze locked on the courtroom doors. Daniel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, a silent reassurance. Then, finally, the doors opened. The jury returned, their expressions unreadable. Every breath in the room seemed to still. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in their hands. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bryce Walker, guilty on all counts. A wave of reaction surged through the courtroom, gasps, murmurs, even quiet applause. Some sighed in relief, others wiped away tears. Walker sat frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. His legal team murmured among themselves, bracing for the inevitable defeat. Vivian felt an immense weight lift, as though a boulder had been removed from her chest. She turned to Sandra, who gave her a small, knowing smile. Daniel stood, his eyes shining with pride. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed. The waiting crowd erupted into cheers the moment Vivian stepped out. Applause thundered through the air, a chorus of triumph. Supporters gathered around her, their faces glowing with admiration. Camera flashes flickered like bursts of lightning, capturing a moment the city would never forget. A young reporter, her voice trembling with emotion, stepped forward, microphone in hand. Miss Sinclair, is there anything you'd like to say to everyone? Vivian took a deep breath, scanning the sea of hopeful faces. Then she spoke, her voice firm, her heart full. Today, we proved that justice is not a privilege, it is a right. This isn't just my victory, it belongs to everyone who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or unheard. I hope that from this moment forward, no one will ever fear speaking up. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising together in a single undeniable truth. Justice had prevailed. The applause echoed through the streets, and Vivian felt joy and relief flood her heart. She turned to Daniel and Sandra, seeing the pride in their smiles. This wasn't just the satisfaction of winning, it was proof that their efforts and courage had not been in vain. As the congratulations poured in, Daniel gently pulled Vivian aside to a quieter corner. "You did it, Vivian," he said, his voice low but full of warmth. "You've changed more than you realize." Vivian smiled, her eyes reflecting hope. "We did it," she corrected, her voice filled with gratitude. "But this is just the beginning. There's still so much to do to ensure justice is upheld." Sandra stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with determination. "And we will," she said firmly. "That's one thing I know for sure." Vivian turned back to the crowd still gathered on the courthouse steps, waving and calling her name. They were living proof of change, the power of courage and unyielding determination. She descended the steps, the warm sunlight touching her face, as if reminding her that justice, though difficult, could be achieved if one refused to give up. With steady steps, she embraced the reality of a new journey ahead, one that she and her supporters would continue to write. A journey fueled by resolve and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The conclusion of Vivian's story stands as a powerful testament to courage, perseverance, and the ability to create change in the face of injustice. It reminds us that no matter how difficult the fight, standing up for what is right is always worth it. Justice is never easy. But with people like Vivian, Sandra, Daniel, and Grant willing to take a stand, it becomes real, tangible, and achievable. The final message of this story is clear. None of us should remain silent in the face of injustice. Stand up, not only for yourself but for those who cannot raise their voices, because only when we come together, supporting and uplifting each other, does justice truly prevail.